And now more than ever, I believe our relationship, our strength is needed. Because we've got to ask ourselves, after the success of winning the Cold War, why is it that authoritarians are on the march around the world? And of course, it's President Putin who's responsible for the appalling actions in Ukraine. But we have to ask ourselves, what was it about what we did that we could have done differently? And I fear that we showed weakness. We didn't invest enough in our defense. We didn't make sure that we were economically robust. And we made it easier for Putin to act with impunity. And at the heart of that is the fact that our economies simply haven't been growing fast enough. We've seen low growth now for several decades. And this is particularly acute in the United Kingdom. Real incomes haven't increased significantly since the financial crisis. And the average GDP per capita in the UK is now 30% less than it is in the United States. That is not a good position for us to be in. It was much closer 2 decades ago. The symptoms that we're seeing are low growth, we're seeing high cost of living, and we're seeing real wages having declining value. The disease is ever larger government, and we have to ask ourselves, with our economies in the state they are now, are we going to be match fit to take on China in the decades ahead? And are we going to be able to make the case that our model, Anglo-American capitalism, is better than Chinese state capitalism? The sad truth is what I think we've seen over the past few years is a new kind of economic model taking hold in our countries, one that's focused on redistributionism, on stagnation, and on the imbuing of woke culture into our businesses. I call these people the anti-growth movement, and they come in many shapes and sizes. There are the vested interests who don't want challenge and don't want competition. They've always been there. But they've been joined by socialists in environmental clothing, who in the name of combating climate change insist that we should simply stop virtually every kind of economic activity. And then we have the ESG culture, perpetrated by many in big corporations, where the focus is on hitting a diversity target or hitting a social target, rather than actually generating money for employees and for the country. And of course, this model results in more taxes, it results in more subsidies, and it results in more regulation. I think we can see that with President Biden's Inflation Reduction Act. It's going to cost US taxpayers $400 billion. It's going to encourage US industry to spend their time rent seeking and going to the government for those subsidies. And it's also going to cut competitors out of the market, including companies in the United Kingdom. Another good example is the UK ban on fracking. This is despite the fact that energy costs in the UK are twice what they are in the United States. And what we are now doing is we are buying gas from America, fracked gas. We are freezing it to minus 260 degrees Fahrenheit. We're transporting it across the Atlantic Ocean, and then we're regasifying it in Britain. Now, why on earth does that make economic or environmental sense? It simply doesn't. Or what about our defense industries that are struggling to get investment because they're not deemed socially acceptable? Just as a time when we are using more weaponry to help support the Ukrainians, our defense industries aren't able to raise the funds they need in all cases because of some of these ESG requirements. Across the board, what we see is it's getting harder and harder to get things done, and it's getting harder to get on. overall, the Anglo-American model of capitalism is being subverted. And the Heritage Foundation itself, in its own Index of Economic Freedom, has shown that the US and the UK are falling down the league table. And in fact, the UK has now fallen behind Germany in terms of our level of economic freedom. I fear that our countries are becoming social democracies by the back door. And we've ended up in a culture where too many people and too many businesses expect a bailout. Now, one of the core beliefs of Margaret Thatcher was the belief in personal responsibility. It was the idea that it's down to you, how you get on in life, that through your own ideas, your own hard work, through your family, you can make your way in the world. That was the core idea. But I think that notion has been eroded. And I think we can all understand why. Back in the financial crisis, many people who made the wrong decisions in the banks didn't feel the full responsibility and accountability for what they'd done. They were bailed out. And lots of people ask the question, well, if we're going to bail out some of the richest people in our society, why shouldn't I be entitled to some money from the government? And that's the culture we've created. So we've ended up in a situation following the financial crisis and following COVID, where there was even more money given out and supplied by the government. And in the UK, that amounted to £400 billion. I think in the US, it was $5 trillion. We've ended up in a situation where people see the government as the concierge. I've got a problem, I'll call the government. You know, my business is failing. I'll get on the phone and sort it out. My investment isn't doing very well. It's the government's problem. I can't buy a house. I need to call the government. But I can tell you, as somebody who's worked in government for many years, that is not the answer, and it's not sustainable. I don't think people really understand how big the government's actually got. If you listen to some of the left-wing media and the left-wing commentators, you would think we're living in some kind of Ayn Rand skeletal state. It's not true. At the turn of the millennium, the state was spending 29% and 36% of national income in the United States and the United Kingdom. Today, those figures are 35% in the US and 47% in the UK. That is virtually half of every pound in Britain is now being spent by the state. It almost makes the eras of Bill Clinton and Tony Blair look like some kind of libertarian paradise. And I really worry that if we don't change course now, those figures are going to get even worse. Because all of this state spending just creates more demand. More demand for subsidies, more demand for higher taxes, more demand for regulation. It becomes a vicious circle. And everybody who's affected, the entrepreneurs, the businesses, the landlords, they look to the government rather than looking to what they could do to get on. And this has been aided and abetted by the central banks, with artificially low interest rates, pumping more money in and keeping that whole system going. Now, the reason I'm in politics and the reason I remain in politics is I don't believe that's what ordinary voters want. I don't believe that this is the society that people in Main Street in the US or the High Street in the UK actually want to see. I believe that people want to have control of their own lives, develop their own futures, have their own businesses. I don't believe they want to be dependent on government handouts. People aspire to a higher standard of living. They want their children to have a better life than they had. And that is what we have to deliver.